Good evening and welcome. I'm Carol Van Valkenburg. It's nice to see such a great turnout tonight. For journalists, it's especially heartening to know that people will still pay for information. At least some people. I'm pleased to introduce Peggy Kuhr, who 2 years ago became the 7th dean in the School of Journalism's 95-year history. Her arrival on campus coincided with the school's move into its state-of-the-art $14 million facility, Don Anderson Hall. Less happily, it also coincides with a period of immense change in the news media, which I'm sure you'll hear more about in just a few minutes. The students and faculty in the School of Journalism are grateful to have a professional at the helm during this period of transition. Dean Kuhr has spent most of her professional life in the news media, so she speaks with both experience and authority. After graduating from UM in 1973 with degrees in journalism and French, she did postgraduate work at the Université de Rouen in France, and her first job in journalism was for her hometown newspaper, the Great Falls Tribune, where she was an editorial writer and later editorial page editor. In 1981, she took a year's leave of absence from the Tribune when she won a National Endowment for the Humanities Journalism Fellowship at the University of Michigan. From 1983 to 1986, she worked for the Hartford Courant as assistant Metro editor and as Sunday deputy Metro editor. Dean Kuhr was lured back west in 1986 by the Spokesman Review, where she stayed until 2002, holding a number of posts that culminated with a job as managing editor for content. During her tenure in Spokane, she also earned a master's degree in organizational leadership from Gonzaga University. Over the years, other newspapers occasionally tried to lure her from Spokane, but she resisted until the University of Kansas offered her its night chair on the press, leadership, and community in 2002. She has spent several years immersed in the study of community journalism, investigating its evolution and its opportunities. That study informs her lecture tonight, Journalism's Brave New World. Dean Kuhr.
Thank you, Carol, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to see all of you here tonight, especially given the competition. Since we have President Obama giving his first State of the Nation address, even as we speak. All I can say is that you can TiVo the president, but you can't TiVo me. I also would like to thank the Alumni Association for sponsoring the lecture series. What a wonderful opportunity for the university and the Missoula communities to get together on a regular basis. I'm going to start by sharing the context that I use when thinking about journalism in the 21st century. Here are 3 of my personal touchstones that help give me perspective about our topic. Touchstone number 1, the Wallenda factor. Let me read you some headlines about the world of news journalism. A year of turmoil. Special section, ethics. How fast are we falling? Learning to love lower profits. The thrill is gone. Those headlines are from the world of journalism in 1995 and early 1996. And that was the time when I was rereading a book about leadership by Warren Bennis and Bert Nanis. It was called Leadership: The Strategies for Taking Charge. And in their book, they talk about the Wallenda factor. It was named after Karl Wallenda, the great tightrope walker. Every time he walked the tightrope, he was in danger of losing his life, for he worked without a net. So he put all of his energy into where it counted, walking the wire. And after years as the greatest aerialist in the world, he fell to his death in 1978. In their book, the authors talk with his widow, and she recalls his death. This is how they quote her. All Karl thought about for 3 straight months prior to it was falling. It was the first time he'd ever thought about that, And it seemed to me that he put all of his energies into not falling rather than walking the tightrope. For me, that's the lesson of the tightrope for the news media. We are on a treacherous path these days, and we have been for a number of years. Those of us who care about the news media, whether we're in the business or not, we need to put our energies into walking the tightrope, into succeeding. We should stop placing so very much energy into not falling. We could spend this entire evening together talking about the layoffs, the pullbacks, the bankruptcies, the near bankruptcies. But there's a body of study called appreciative inquiry. And it says that human systems grow in the direction of what they persistently ask questions about. Now, appreciative inquiry doesn't mean that you ignore or you dismiss counts of problems, just that we don't see them as the basis for our analysis and all of our actions. Touchstone number 2 is my grandmother, Hulda Burns. That's a picture of her outside of Chinook at the Chief Joseph battlefield with a friend of hers. When I was in college and studying journalism, we'd go and visit my grandparents in Chinook. And every time we'd visit, I would just pray that my grandmother would forget to make this request. "Peggy," she would say, and she was very definite. She'd hand me a pencil and a piece of paper and say, "Write something down that I can take to the opinion." For you see, one of the most important columns in the weekly newspaper there, which was called the Chinook Opinion, was the one that carried information from the local residents. It was family news, who was visiting, who was traveling somewhere, what people were doing. At the time, I was mortified. That's not journalism, I'd think. But I'd write a paragraph, and the very next week, it would be in the paper. The lesson. Some of the most compelling newspaper content came not from the paid journalists, but from ordinary people contributing their own news. Today, that's what we call citizen journalism. What's old is new again in today's new media world. My third touchstone goes to my Kansas days. Ooh, I'm losing my pieces of paper. We're done with that one. For the year before I came to the University of Montana, I worked with my journalism students at the University of Kansas, and we developed an after-school journalism program for middle school students at Rosedale Middle School in Kansas City, Kansas. Truthfully, these 6th, 7th, and 8th graders were not that interested in journalism. We basically offered them something to do after school. But there was one time that year when everyone who was there was entirely engrossed in the act of writing. And that was the day when one of my KU students, Rhonda Lavaldo, led them in a lesson about storytelling. And instead of talking about her personal story, she danced it. Rhonda is an Acoma Pueblo tribal member, and she's a jingle dress dancer. After her dance, she let the students ask her what it was like to grow up on the Pueblo outside of Albuquerque. And then she said, "You have your own stories. You have your own family traditions. Go and write them." And those students raced across the cafeteria back to the Mac lab, this time not to play games on the computer, but to write. The lesson? We need to remember that the way we make sense of our world is storytelling. There are so many undercovered people and so many undercovered stories, no matter where we live. One of the most powerful roles of journalism is to open up access, not close it down. And so tonight, I'm going to remember the tightrope and the Chinook Opinion and the Rosedale students, and I'm not going to focus on all the gloom and the doom. The myth that I want to lay low is that journalism is dying, that the end is near, that the sky is falling, and that society is going to be the worse off for the way things are these days in the news media. Tonight, this will be a mini tour of what gives me and many others, to use an overused word, hope about journalism today. It by no means is a complete listing, just a taste, but a taste to show you another master narrative for journalism in the United States and here in Montana. If there's one core message that I want to leave you with tonight, it's this. We have seen a power shift where the professional journalist is no longer at the center of the news universe. It's not a one-way delivery of news and information these days. Thanks to technology, which makes it easy and relatively inexpensive, you can share pictures, audio, and video. And that means we're seeing the blurring of the line between the journalist and the audience, or the people formerly known as the audience. Today, many of us want our news to be instant and interactive. So we're going to start this tour by looking at some coverage of the recent presidential inauguration that you may not have seen. Here, Current TV teamed up with Twitter to cover the event. You could watch Current's coverage live on your computer, and you could also watch people sending text messages around the world about what they were watching.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Barack H. Obama.
Now you can see these text messages go across the screen as the event is occurring. And you can even comment on Aretha Franklin's hat if you would like to.
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
CNN teamed up with Facebook, the social networking site, for inauguration coverage. Interaction with the news, many people talking to many other people, is what you see. And what Facebook and CNN found was a lot of people wanted to get involved. And tonight, CNN and Facebook are teamed up together again with the president's speech. With technology, we can also put updates together on a map and a timeline so you can see what's happening and where it's happening. I'm going to show you a map and a timeline of Twitter posts, little short text messages that were sent across the globe on Inauguration Day. So you can see we have Europe over here. You can see what time, and over there we've got the United States. And as we get closer to the time of the inauguration, you can see the activity picking up quite a bit. This goes on for quite some time. We're looking basically at today. And what you'll notice is as the time wears on, Europe goes to sleep. And in the United States, as time goes on, the West Coast gets more active than the East Coast. Finally, with the inauguration, here's a photo mosaic that's offered by the Washington Post. This overall photograph was taken by a Post photographer, and then using thousands of images taken by people who had attended the ceremonies that day, including Post photographers and AP photographers, this collage was created. It is interactive, so you can move around on it and you can explore what's going on. You can zoom in to any one of those individual images and see all kinds of people who are contributing their view to the overall event. We are now in a world where people want to consume news and be part of the news conversation at the same time. In one of the books that I recommended for this lecture reading list that you may have all taken a look at, Elements of Journalism, the authors Kovach and Rosenstiel point out that news satisfies a basic human impulse. And basically that means we have a need to know what's going on beyond our own immediate experience. And some of us have a love for telling others what's going on. Those generally have been journalists. So I ask you, how did you find out about that US Airways plane that went down last month? Well, Johannes Krums was on a ferry crossing the Hudson River. Using his phone, he posted this message and this photograph on his Twitter site. What is Twitter? If you're Missoulian subscribers and you read the Sunday paper, in the business section, there was a story about it. It's a free social networking and micro or mini blogging site that you can sign up for, and it will allow you to post short text messages, no longer than 140 characters. And using a related Twitter service, you can also post photographs. Your updates are shown on your Twitter profile page, and others can sign up to follow you. The news media are getting into this big time. We're not sure if we want to follow this all the time, but look at this. Here's the time the plane went down, 3:31. 5 minutes later, Giannis posts his photograph and his message. And then the New York Times catches up. The New York Times gets a full story up within a half hour of the plane landing on the river. These days, that's often the way the world first learns about a major unexpected event, from ordinary citizens using their mobile phones. For instance, the attacks in Mumbai, India, in December. Twitter, the first accounts from those hotels. The 2008 earthquake in China, wedding pictures that were sent out during the earthquake. The tsunami off the coast of Indonesia in 2004. It was pictures and notices from tourists who were there. We had the bombings of the trains in the London Underground in 2005. And I mentioned that because the BBC, the minute it found out about those bombings, asked people to send messages and send them their pictures. And it was through a breakthrough moment in opening the door of professional journalism to content from people formerly known as the audience. The BBC reported that within 6 hours of those events, it had received more than 20,000 emails, more than 1,000 photographs, and 20 videos. Citizen journalism is extending far beyond the world of breaking news. In many parts of this country, people don't get the news that they want or the news that they deserve. And if you think about it, professional journalism just can't cover everything everywhere. So this is what I call intentional citizen journalism. And it happens because there's a need for news and because today concerned citizens can develop a website and fill that need. This is an online newspaper that was founded 3.5 years ago when a small group of residents in Deerfield, New Hampshire decided that if no regular news media was in their town and they didn't know what was going on at their town meetings, the classic New England town meeting, they might have to do it themselves. So they incorporated under the auspices of the public library and formed the Deerfield Forum. In their first 9 months, the operation grew from 10 contributors to 72. They started getting advertising support, and they even published in that first year 2 print editions that they delivered to people who did not have computer access. They have since expanded into 3 neighboring towns, and they have competition. The regional newspapers are stopping by now to find out what's going on in Deerfield. Let's move from New Hampshire to Chappaqua, New York. This is the homepage for Newcastle Now. This news site was started less than 2 years ago by 3 self-described moms. They were concerned that they lived in a community where it wasn't getting local, regular news coverage. In fact, the local New York Times across the way really only paid attention when their most famous residents, Bill and Hillary Clinton, were in town. So like the forum in New Hampshire, the number of volunteers has grown. The number of advertisers has grown, and it is what is called a robust news website. This online paper goes up each Friday. They work like crazy during the early part of the week, all the way through Thursday night, and they post it Friday morning. Then they take Friday, Saturday, and Sunday off so they can spend time with their families. We're going to listen to Anne-Marie Fallon and Christine Uris talk about Newcastle Now. They're the publisher and managing editor.
Started with 500 people as email. We email our magazine or our newspaper out every Friday. And we originally started with 500 email addresses. And now we're up to 2,200. So we think the community, as people learn about it, they're registering to receive it every Friday.
What about Montana? I can tell you that the journalism school has been experimenting with helping small communities develop their own citizen news sites. Through a project called Rural News Network, journalism faculty and students have worked in the past several years with Dutton and with Crow Agency. In Dutton, we worked with a town that had lost its local weekly. It had closed a few years earlier. And when the rural news class said they were coming to town just to see if citizens wanted a news site, 80 people showed up. The Dutton Country Courier was the result. This journalism school project has prompted the nearby Shoto-Acantha to begin to offer small towns in its coverage area, including Dutton, their own community news sites. And we're hoping to turn over our expertise and the Dutton Country Courier to the owners of the Acantha. This is the homepage for the other Rural News Network site, Crow News. And again, it's in a community that did not have its own local paper. Today, several former students and the uncle of one of those students keep it going. I can tell you that seeing citizens participate in covering their own communities makes me optimistic about journalism today. Will it replace professional journalism? Not at all. We don't live in an either-or world. There is a demand for both kinds of journalists. So let's move on in our tour. The Diversity Institute is in Nashville, Tennessee, and it works to recruit and train young people of color for mainstream journalism careers. The Institute, which is funded by the Freedom Forum, which is a nonprofit foundation that's dedicated to freedom of the press and free speech, believes that news organizations, to serve their readers, viewers, and listeners, have to have news staffs and stories that they cover and that reflect fully the diversity of their own communities. So every summer, a select number of minority journalism students attends this institute for intensive multimedia training and journalism training. So here's a peek at two stories that students did last summer after just a couple days of training. The first is about Tootsie's Orchid Lounge in Nashville, and the second about a girl learning to box.
There's three famous places in Nashville. One is Tootsie's Orchid Lounge, the Grand Ole Opry, and the Country Music Hall of Fame.
Tootsie was she was the musician's best friend.
She said that Elvis walked through here one night when he got kicked off the Opry.
She's probably right. It's probably
She was the kind of lady that if a new artist couldn't afford nothing, she would try and stick a $10, $20 bill in her pocket without them knowing.
Tootsie's to me is where I go back to 1970 when I had a record on the jukebox, and Tootsie was good enough to put my picture up on the wall. It's probably still down there somewhere.
Well, a lot of the artists, like Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings and all of them, used to leave, run out the back door of the Ryman, run over to Tootsie's, grab a drink, okay, and then run back. And Willie Nelson used to say, yeah, it may only be 25 steps over, but it's 55 back.
I come up here pretty much every day. I didn't know there was, an actual boxing gym, if anything, in Nashville. I just kind of fell in love the first time. And then, all the people are here are so nice. It's like a second home. Good. Everybody, I've had my parents come down here, and my dad's just like, whoa, I can't believe you do that stuff. I've had a past in fighting, so I know how to throw punches.
Here at the journalism school, we're home to a project called ResNet. This is a mentoring and training project to bring more young Native Americans into mainstream journalism. ResNet is also a news site. It offers comprehensive coverage from Indian country, both that done by students and that done by professionals. Some of ResNet's coverage is original, and some is aggregated from other sources, such as the Associated Press. This is an Associated Press story. Actually, it's a Missoulian story that was picked up by the AP, and as AP members, we then pick it up. And then we had a journalism student whose Blackfeet go and do a sound slideshow to match it.
My name is Pat Pierre, tribal elder. I belong to the Elders Advisory Board. I've been teacher here in Kusum for going on 6 years, teaching language. hopefully one day to have all our children speak in our language again. And I've made a commitment, a lifetime commitment to teaching here, to see this language come back to our people. And 79 years old, starting out on another 79, so that's the way it is.
On ResNet, you can find news, you can find a video of the day, and you can find the daily cartoon that's called Without Reservations. This is done by a young man out of Santa Fe. Today we hear a lot of talk about new funding models for journalism, basically because the current funding models are facing as many challenges as the nation's economy. There are some subscription-based models, and not all of them are new. If you consider the Wall Street Journal's online edition, which really has been charging for content, for premium content, for years. What's more current is a discussion of micropayments, kind of on the order of iTunes, where you might pay a small amount of money for regular access to news content. There's also a fair amount of discussion about content and what news sites that are funded by foundations and individuals. So we're going to take a look at ProPublica. This is a nonprofit, nonpartisan investigative news operation that began last year. ProPublica has its own editors and reporters, and it also collaborates with other news organizations around the country on stories. It also is an aggregator, which means it aims to be a one-stop location where you can find all kinds of investigative stories being done all over the country. Here's part of a story that resulted from an investigation into what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, when, in some neighborhoods, vigilantes took law enforcement into their own hands.
August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina.
When Hurricane Katrina ripped into New Orleans, most people tried to flee. In one neighborhood, however, a band of 15 to 30 people refused to evacuate. With the police department crippled, these people amassed weapons and began patrolling the streets. Before long, bullets began to fly. Over the past 18 months, I've interviewed figures on all sides of the gunfire. The gunmen, people who were shot and survived, and witnesses to the violence.
I couldn't walk through Algiers Park.
You couldn't?
Oh, no, I could stay on my block. But if I would have turned that corner, I would have been in a firefight.
It was great.
It was great.
It was like pheasant season in South Dakota.
Right on.
If it moved, you shot it.
That's not a pheasant. We're not in South Dakota. What's wrong with this picture?
Exactly how many people were shot by vigilantes is still unclear, but eyewitnesses say 11 people, all black males, were shot in and around Algiers Point after the storm.
You know, you never think that'll happen to you in your wildest imagination. You know, I mean, you hear about people getting shot all the time. You know, you watch the news and you see things like that, but in my own, you know, my own experience, my own, you know, in my life, never thought that'd happen to me, you know what I mean?
I want to mention two things about this. First, the reporter who did the story was funded by multiple sources. Again, a model for journalism today. The reporting was supported by the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute, so that's the Nation magazine, among other things. It was paid for by ProPublica, and it was paid for by the Washington, D.C. Center for Investigative Reporting, which has been around for a number of years, and by New American Media, which is out of California. The second thing I do want to tell you tonight, and this is my commercial portion, the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, Paul Steiger, is going to be giving a lecture here on campus, right in this very room, next Monday evening, 8 o'clock. Also, Paul Steiger was previously the managing editor, which is the top editor position at the Wall Street Journal. So I think he will give us an instructive lesson as well in moving from the old world to the new world of journalism. And here are two examples of nonprofit journalism that are community-centered, and they're relevant to two geographic communities. This is Voice of San Diego. These kinds of sites are often run by journalists who leave mainstream news operations to explore new models of serious, hard-hitting, and often investigative journalism. It's the kind that many people say isn't being done anymore by traditional news organizations. The Voice of San Diego does not pretend to cover all of that city. It has basically outlined 6 areas that it wants to own. And they are government, education, science, housing, economics, and environment. It's getting a lot of attention these days. And here is some attention it got from an LA Times columnist who said, "The lessons appear to be these. A local news site can flourish on charitable donations. It helps to have one big benefactor to get things started, and it makes more sense to cover a few topics well rather than a lot poorly." The large benefactor is a businessman who made his money in real estate and technology, and so the story goes, was upset with the lack of hard-hitting city government coverage. So he met with several folks, including the former editor of the San Diego paper, and they talked about starting their own news site. Started with the contribution of $355,000, and the businessman who started it did not control anything about the editorial content. The thing I did learn was he sat down and gave these journalists a lesson in how to run a business. They now have a budget of just under $900,000, and they have 11 full-time journalists. And they give the San Diego Union-Tribune a run for its money. Here's the Min Post, Minneapolis. They try to cover a lot of things that are going on in Minnesota and really focus in on Minneapolis. It's run by the former editor, who also then became the publisher of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. This started with funding from 4 families, a total of $850,000. It has since received help from major journalism foundations. And I'll give you an update. Min Post and Voice of San Diego both say they are entering some of their work in this year's Pulitzer Prize competition. That's because for the first time, the Pulitzer Prizes is going to have an online news category. As long as your content is original and you publish at least weekly with your organization, you can enter the Pulitzers. So, who says journalism has to be about all of the serious news and the hard-hitting investigative work? I think we need to have some fun once in a while, and sometimes journalism's just been seen as the broccoli of the news diet. So, you know, we often get very serious about issues where perhaps a lighter touch would be entirely appropriate, and many of you will remember this Missoula issue.
You know, I've been knocking on doors because I'm a city council candidate, and at least once a day somebody asks me, "Are you for the chickens?" People who want the chickens legalized are fired up about it because they see themselves as part of a movement that's bringing themselves in closer contact with their food. The people who oppose it seem to have a lot of different reasons.
They put out an aroma, and they're messy.
If you allow chickens in the neighborhoods, you're going to get neighbors against neighbors eventually, because something's going to go wrong.
The proposed ordinance has inspired both comedy and drama.
The biggest concern that people talk about is roosters, and the very first thing in the ordinance is that you're not allowed to have roosters.
People usually move to town to get away from farm animals, and it troubles me that people don't really realize what's going to come if they start having a bunch of chickens next door to them.
Just mixing the
country, with the city, you're gonna have a lot of problems.
One of my chickens was partially eaten by a dog, and I had to kill her, and I ate her, and she was delicious.
It just seems so ridiculous talking about chickens in the city.
In my opinion, I wish the city would spend a little more time dealing with these long-range comprehensive issues. And if they've got time for chickens, fine.
Games are another tool being used to explore new ways to tell news stories. This is a game that was developed by Chevron and The Economist Group. Think The Economist magazine out of London and Roll Call magazine out of Washington, D.C. The intention of the game is to let us work through the economic, the environmental, and the security trade-offs as we try to figure out how to supply a city with power. Gaming may be one tool to help us understand real complexities of a lot of topics. For instance, how do you balance paying for everything that we like in government today with the funds that are available, or the choices of raising taxes? What are the trade-offs as the U.S. tries to pull out of Iraq? Sometimes a game can show you what's going to happen if you make a certain decision. And it is seen as a new area for journalism today. Where competition once was the rule, competition on the business side between journalism entities and competition definitely on the news side as well, we're now seeing unprecedented levels of collaboration. This is just one example that I pulled out. In Philadelphia, Fox, yes, and NBC are working together on local news coverage. Instead of each station having to send its own crew to cover an event, this new news service will send a crew and then send video to each station. Fox and NBC say they're planning to do this in 5 other major markets within the next year. There's another role about journalists that I want to talk about tonight. Beyond such cooperation, we have the idea of community connector. NewWest.net is a news organization that was founded here in Missoula in 2005, and its aim is to cover growth and change in the Rocky Mountain West. It features what its founder, Jonathan Weber, calls pro-am journalism, as opposed to citizen journalism. It's a mix of full-time professional journalists with citizen contributors, some of whom write for free. Some of the commentators are paid a flat fee, and some of them are paid according to the traffic that they generate online. What I want to talk about for a little bit tonight is the fact that New West also hosts conferences. So far, it has put together 4 conferences. Those in Missoula are about growth and development. It has done one in Bozeman on design and has another one planned for this spring. And then one is in the works on planning for Boise. Hundreds of people attend these conferences. There were 300 at this one in Missoula this last fall. And it is an opportunity for people to come together with different backgrounds and different areas of expertise, stay in the same room and share information about all kinds of problems facing our region. Here's a clip.
I don't see any signs of substantive economic growth occurring in the U.S. economy till literally the second quarter of 2010. 2009 is going to be a bad year.
Our view is 2009 will be tough, maybe kind of a carbon copy of the second half of 2008. And my crystal ball says we don't see any meaningful improvement in 2010.
I think this economy is going to steadily get worse for probably 2, maybe 3 years. Just if you look at all the indicators, you can't lose $2 trillion in the stock market as we've done this year and have it not ripple through every part of our economy.
To me, this is a notable example of journalist as connector, as contributing to, not dominating, the community conversation. And basically, it's offering a format where the conversation can occur. New West has also figured out how to offer continuing credit to some of those who attend these conferences through the various universities and institutions. At the journalism school, we have our own community moderating class in the form of the Footbridge Forum. This is a radio project where students each semester select a topic that they think is of interest on campus and in Missoula. They find experts, and then they put on 3 live talk shows where they have experts on board and people can call in their questions. We're going to listen to a little clip from this last fall where the topic was homelessness. What you'll hear first is a student moderator, and that's followed up by a counselor at an elementary school here that has the largest homeless population of children in the state.
I don't know, Crystal, when you deal with the kids that you have there, what kind of effect do you think it would have just for them to have a semi-stable place to stay? I mean,
it makes a huge difference in attendance. It makes a difference. It makes a difference in quality of schoolwork, in the meals that they might get once they reach home. I think it makes a difference in mental health. I think that without your housing needs met, everything else starts to fall apart.
What we're experiencing is a new news ecology. Some people call this networked journalism or horizontal journalism, where content is offered, shared, linked to, and where the professional journalist is one part of the ecosystem, but again, not the sole supplier. And all of this means that the role of journalists in traditional mainstream operations has become much more complex. It's a world where in Montana, newspaper publishers and editors know that the print product is still heavily favored, and that is by adults from age 18 on up. In 2007 and 2008, Lee Enterprises conducted an extensive survey across its largest markets. And I have just one slide. This is from the Billings Gazette results. In the Billings market, they did 601 interviews with adults. Overall, Lee found that the reach of the print newspapers alone, and then the reach of the online papers, and then the reach of them combined in all categories had increased significantly from 2007 to 2008. And it's a world where, to use Billings as an example, the managing editor, Steve Przinski, and 5 other people monitor all reader comments before they can be posted on the website. It's a bit of scrutiny as the paper tries to navigate the line between encouraging a lively community conversation and encouraging a minimum, at least, of civility. It's a world where Missoulian editor Sherry Devlin says that she runs one newsroom dedicated to 2 products. Every journalist in the newsroom is a print journalist and an online journalist. And if you've taken a look at the W.R. Grace page that the Missoulian has put together, you can see that in action. It also is a world where new niche print products can do well with readers and with advertisers. The Great Falls Tribune publisher Jim Strauss runs a paper that is among the top 3 performing newspapers in all of Gannett. Now, you may not think that about my hometown being an economic engine in the state of Montana, but the Great Falls Tribune is one of the leading Gannett papers. And in addition to working on the website, the Tribune has seen success with new print products. And I'm going to mention just one here that the publisher told me about. It's called the Front Range Guardian, and it's a weekly tabloid-sized newspaper, and it has content only of interest to military people in the area. They get content from the Malmstrom Air Force Base Public Information Office and content from their own Tribune reporters. And I found one bit of information today. It says they have about 12,000 readers. Even at the World Company in Lawrence, Kansas, you find news leaders talking about what they're going to do new with print. I say even at the World Company, which is a family-owned operation, because news companies around the world send representatives to Kansas to look at this innovative news model. And it was one of the earliest adopters of cable television and seeing kind of some future there. It's gotten into the local phone business, and it is one of the very earliest entrants into online daily journalism. last year, to strengthen the newspaper, they got together and put together a new section, and it's called Go. It's a 32-page tabloid section, a magazine, and it is aimed at women and young families, and it is wrapped around the Monday paper every day. It's not as inserted into, it is a wraparound. And it has become a success with advertisers, new advertising. They haven't pulled advertising from one section of the paper and put it in here. They found it was popular with their target audience, and now they've discovered more men are reading it than they had expected. Now remember, we started this tour with a look at some of the interactive features surrounding the inauguration coverage. But it's not just fun stuff like a mosaic of a photograph or the Twitter feeds of comments around the world. Here's a sample of some examples from local newspapers, and I put these in the category of news you can use and news that also is interactive. This is from the Las Vegas Sun. And as you navigate this, you can see what town you're flying out of and where you're flying to and what the average delay might be. You can also find out what the average wait will be at one of the security checkpoints, depending on day of the week and time of day. Here's the Missoulian, which just in the last few days has put its crime map online. It's an interactive map now where you're able to click on any one of those bubbles and move yourself around town. You can make the neighborhood larger, you can make it smaller. Much more interactive. The Billings Gazette is working on garage sale maps that look like this, that are interactive. And I have found on the Missoulian a spot now that has open houses, where you could be able to chart your own course with all the open houses and figure out how you're going to drive from one to the other. Another thing we can do is using panorama shots. We can put ourselves right in the middle of the action to see what it's like. In this case, we can watch Dennis Kucinich at the Democratic National Convention in Denver answer questions.
Congress is not doing its job in holding this administration accountable. That's why I've taken that stand.
I have one more question. There was not as many Nevada issues that were brought up in this debate tonight. Yucca was mentioned briefly, Yucca Mountains.
Let's talk about that. I voted 6 times against the siting of a nuclear facility.
In the end, though, we are left with the power of story. This is an example from the Washington Post and the stories of ordinary people who were seated in front of a white wall and asked to talk about themselves. It's a series called On Being, and every week a new mini profile is added to the lineup.
Well, I'm Naomi and I'm 12 years old. I'm 12 right now, but like in a month I'm going to be 13. I don't think Mom and Dad are actually like paying attention to my birthday. It's a big step. I'm gonna be a teenager and then just like, not that big. 16's big, not 13. I keep on telling them, they don't really pay attention.
I can be described with so many different sort of words, and most of them have no meaning for most people. I'm an evolutionary biologist, an invertebrate zoologist, a paleobiologist, a marine biologist. Probably the easiest thing would be starfish biologist. My mom doesn't even know what I do.
In Spain, when I was a child, being a musician was a very strange thing, you know. It wasn't very well regarded. It was like, ooh. At some point in your life, there is a moment in which you say, what is what makes me more happy than anything? When is when you are yourself 100%? And for me, it was music.
Great stories are the heart of great journalism. They can be complex, and they can be quite simple. They can include people we rarely heard from before, people from Algiers Point, that neighborhood in New Orleans, people from Washington, D.C., who aren't politicians or lobbyists. And as we put all of this together in this digital, fast-changing world of news media today, I can see much good to come from it. Thank you very much. One thing I do want to do before we have questions is I want you to join me in thanking Ann Medley, who graduated from the master's program in journalism in December, and really who developed this multimedia show for you tonight. She also is the author of the chicken video story. So thank you. Use that mic, I guess. Technology. Is it working?
It is working. Can you hear me now? Yes. Dean Kuhr welcomes your questions, but we are recording this, and so we want to be able to have your questions recorded and also have everyone able to hear them. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll come back and pass the mic off to you, and if you'll speak into the mic, everyone will be able to hear you, and so will the dean, and she'll be happy to provide whatever answers.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk. A lot of what I see in the digital journalism here appears to be reporting things. And I'm wondering, where is the in-depth analytical journalism, the opinions, et cetera, that we can read in newspapers now? Where are they going to be coming from?
I think you will see them. You'll see them in newspapers, because I would be the last person to say paper is going away. I think what you'll have is more choice for where you're going to find that news and information. The websites like Voice of San Diego and MinPost and ProPublica, just to name those three, have serious, in-depth analysis and reporting. I was just showing you glimpses, but if you go into any one of those, you'll find extensive work. And many of those journalists are journalists who have left other broadcast stations and other newspapers because they wanted to do that kind of work, and they were looking for a place where they felt that it would be supported.
This is Public Radio Week. Where does radio come into that linkage of news information and analysis?
Well, it's interesting that you would ask that question, because a lot of what you're seeing with these websites for new funding models, many are saying, look at public radio and public television and the funding model of asking for donations. There's an interesting collaboration that I learned about last week among competitors that involves the NewsHour, public television, Marketplace, public radio, and the Christian Science Monitor. And they're going to be announcing this coverage project called Patchwork, and it's a look at the economy in the United States, and then they're going to target 11 various communities to do in-depth individual community examinations. So it's a mix of radio, television, newspaper, people who didn't always work together. Radio fits into the mix as much as television, but it's really probably more public radio than commercial radio at this time. A lot of commercial stations don't have their own independent news reporters. That may come back. It's more likely you're going to hear those kinds of reports online. I can't believe there aren't any more questions about journalism. There's a whole lot that I didn't bring up because I figured you all would ask me about them.
Most of the news that you discussed in this was national news, was U.S. news. And I'm really concerned about the lack of news coverage of international news. Even on, if you watch TV, you don't get any international news really, unless the United States is involved. besides subscribing to BBC or Deutsche Welle, etc., where does one go to get that kind of information?
The way you put that question is great. Where does one go? And the answer is you're going to have to go to sources that you trust and that you think are going to give you that news. A couple of the largest news organizations, I mean, the Associated Press is the largest news organization in the world, and it is not shrinking. As a matter of fact, it has more people around the world and is delivering more international coverage than it has in the past. CNN is another one that is expanding the number of bureaus. Interestingly enough, CNN is also expanding domestically, and it's planning to offer a wire service, story service to newspapers. And some folks think it's going up against, in one sense, the Associated Press. I find a lot of people, they'll use Reuters, they'll use BBC. What you're really seeing now is we all as individuals have much more access and much more choice. It can mean much more work for us as we sort through what we want to find. But definitely for local newspapers, they're asking themselves, what can we offer that nobody else can? And so if I'm at the Spokesman Review or if I'm at the Missoulian, I'm saying international coverage, you can get that anywhere. But you can't find out what's going on here unless you really look at local news sources. So they see their franchise as local. A lot of people have talked about what you need to do is link what's going on locally with international. And that is something that you don't see enough of. It's something I can tell you, gosh, we tried in Spokane. For instance, outside of, in Post Falls, Idaho, which was part of our coverage area, there was Jacqueline Seed Company, which grew bluegrass, all kinds of grass seeds. And their big market in the late 90s, early 2000s was China. So we wanted to have coverage from the AP in China about what was going on with the grass market there that reflected back on what was happening at home for this company and try to do those business links. It takes somebody who's constantly thinking about it. It's something I think there's a demand for, and that would be a way a local paper could say, no one else is going to put this story together. That is news no one can get anywhere else, and that should be my franchise. So that would bring international into local news reports, I think in a good way.
There we go.
Is there any watchdog organization or something because I know when I look at the news that's online that it might not be, totally accurate or, factual really. Is there any group or that's come to watch to make sure that these citizen-supplied stories are accurate?
Actually, overall, no. It's one of the beauties of the First Amendment. You don't have to have a license to practice journalism. You have to have a license to be able to give people haircuts. You have to have a license to be able to do manicures and pedicures and to be a massage therapist, but not to be a journalist.
Well, then what will help us?
That's a great question.
Which ones are really accurate? Or?
Well, that's where, is it me? Oh, Ray's telling me move back. Okay, yeah, I'm moving back from the public here. That's that whole issue of credibility, and that's another area that I'm very passionate about, because I would tell you that I think the news media, in one sense, the mainstream news media, have gotten what's coming to them for a lot of what's gone on, and a lot of the attitude toward the public, like we know what's going on, and don't you question us. Well, now the public says, we don't think so much about you. What you'll find is a growing conversation these days about the need for media literacy. Starting in the schools, I can tell you we're having that conversation here on campus, and it's going on at a number of other campuses, that when you have all of this available, how do you sort through it all? How do you make wise decisions about, what is credible? And what I'll tell you is right now, when you look at credible news media sites, most of them, they come from mainstream media. I mean, it's USA Today, and it's BBC, and it's NBC, and it's all of your networks. and it's the public radio and television stations. So in that sense, traditional news media still have a standard of credibility, despite all the problems, and we know that there are many, of really aiming for accurate, fair stories that are reported in context. Part of it is going to be you, the consumer, having to figure that out. Part of it, I do think, I don't know, but I do think at some point, all of a sudden we're going to say, you know, there's going to be a role for someone who tells me what I ought to really be looking at and who I ought to watch. Right now, it's often, if you think a lot of a certain journalist, you go on their website or on their Facebook page and you see what else are they following. That has credibility for what I might follow. I go and I look and see, you know, what kind of blogs should I be looking at? And I ask people whose viewpoint I trust, and then that gives me an idea for what I might go look at. So a lot of it is happening informally that way, but it's also happening very actively because we're so connected. But it is a challenge. And it's also not to say that, you know, in the good old days, that when you had Lawrence, Kansas, for instance, which is a town about the size of Missoula, when the newspaper family that owns it first moved there, the current publisher was saying they had 8 or 9 newspapers in that town about the size of Missoula. You know, those were days too. I mean, which newspaper did you believe? Which one did you think did the best job? So it's a problem that's been around, but I think it's just multiplied exponentially now because of all the news sources that we have access to. So media literacy is what we have to be looking at next.
I just heard you utter a 4-letter word, blog.
Where is this? Oh.
I wondered if you would talk about bloggers and how they fit into this mix a little bit.
Well, the trouble for me with the word blog is there are blogs, and there are blogs, and there are blogs. And blog doesn't really tell you what it is anymore, other than the fact that it's online and it's something that is presented in kind of reverse chronological order. It's like the word tabloid. A tabloid can be, you know, the Weekly World News at the grocery store, fun to read, not a lot of credibility. Or it can be the Christian Science Monitor was a tabloid newspaper. It's changing. It's not going to be in print anymore. It's going to be a weekly magazine. The Rocky Mountain News was a tabloid. Blogs, there are blogs that are just personal diaries. There are blogs that are merely aggregator sites where there's one for the news media, and they just pull in all kinds of stories that are published elsewhere about the news media, so you can just go to one spot. There are blogs that are very informed commentary. There are blogs that are just rants and screeds. So the word blog doesn't really describe what the content is. And so, you know, blogging, yeah, it has a place in news media. There are some blogs that are very, very, very informative. Almost every reporter now either thinks or is told by his or her editor that you have to have a blog, you have to comment, and you have to do this. Maybe you don't. I think some of this is we're just seeing all of this come upon us, and we're trying it all out, and we're going to see what sticks and what has meaning. But for me, blogging is a word that isn't a bad word. It just doesn't really tell me what the content is. I have a question for the audience while Carol walks back there. Today, the Missoulian has a new format, a new look, and I want to know what you think about it. So maybe when Carol's done with the question, we can just pass that microphone around, because I'd be curious to know what you think about the Missoulian's new efforts. I don't know if we have anyone from the Missoulian here, and if we do, they can answer the questions. It's easier to read on a plane. Okay. And do we have someone back there?
Yeah. Can you tell me what the financial situation is of the newspapers? Does this cost more? Does it cost less? How's the bottom line coming on newspapers for doing this change?
For doing what, the change in general, or the Missoulian, or?
Well, I would say both of them if they're following the same principles.
The bottom line for newspapers, we'll start with the medium and small-sized newspapers. Medium and small-sized newspapers are not suffering nearly as much as the big metro dailies. You know, the community newspapers, by and large, are making money. And newspapers the size of the Missoulian or the Great Falls Tribune are making money. Historically, they've made a huge amount of money, big return on investment year over year. That return is much lower these days. And what's happening for newspapers like the Tribune, which is part of the Gannett chain, or the Lee newspapers here in Montana, is that there are decisions that are made at a corporate level because they made some acquisitions in recent years of big metro papers, and they're suffering. They have an enormous debt load, and that's causing problems that ripple down to papers like the Missoulian, which wind up having to pull back, have some layoffs, make some changes. It's a time of tremendous change and a real shakedown of what's going on in the newspaper industry. Some people will say, if you invented a newspaper today, you would never think that we should cut down a lot of trees, and then we're going to have this big operation where we print these things out on this paper, and then we drive it with fuel costs. We drive it to people's homes and to businesses all across a big area every day. It would not be a model that would be invented, because electronically, we can just get that to you. We can cut out paper costs. We can cut out delivery costs. Some people are saying maybe the money should go into developing, and this has been going on for, this conversation has been around for 20 years. We should develop kind of a fax machine or an e-ink machine. E-ink is out now, where I will pay for you, the subscriber, to have this machine in your home. So rather than my printing the paper, I'll just send it to you electronically and you can print out what you want. Or you can read it online. And that's the challenge. We have an old model with newspaper that is more efficient, really, than looking online. You can skim a lot more quickly. It's a wonderful size screen, even if it's slightly smaller. And it's a great vehicle for advertising. Online, Jim Strauss, the editor at the Tribune, was saying, you know, online, it works great for multimedia stories. We can do things we never could before. We're not finding the answer with online advertising. It's not a great advertising medium yet.
I'm curious about the career paths of the young people you're training. In this changing world of journalism, where are they? What's happening when they leave you? Where are they headed?
They're headed all over. I mean, what we find, first of all, is you still need people who know how to report, which is how do you find out what's going on? You need people then who can write, no matter what form of news media they're going into, and then you need them to know how can they present this news in the best way possible. Should it be in the form of writing? Should it be a broadcast report? Should it be just an audio report? Should it be photography? So where we find they're going is in all of those areas. Our broadcast graduates, there's a demand out there, and they're getting jobs. And they're actually getting jobs at not just the tiniest of markets. I think they're partly getting jobs because we have a new facility. So we have HD digital equipment that is more advanced than a lot of news operations have in the broadcast field. We're getting, gosh, Carol you just sent out an email today or yesterday for? Sports reporter at the Bozeman Chronicle. Yeah, sports reporter in Bozeman. There was a copy editor they were looking for at the Tri-Cities Herald. So we are finding that so far the demand is still there. One of the things that is happening is that at mainstream news operations, if people are taking buyouts, they're the people who have the experience. And those people get replaced by people who are directly out of journalism school or new into the business, and so the costs are a lot lower. In one sense, it's too bad to lose all that experience. In another sense, it's great to have new people into an area and with perhaps some new ideas. We also find, our students wind up going into law school, business school. They're working in research areas for companies. More and more you're finding nonprofits that have a need for, we need to tell people what's going on. It's not really public relations. It's kind of reporting and telling our story. So I'm optimistic that the jobs, and we still have 100% placement for our students, will continue. This has been a big year of change in the industry. So ask me in 2 years. I hope I can give you the same answer.
The fellow down here was wondering about the veracity of some of the things that he comes across on the internet. And it was especially helpful for me during the campaigning for the presidency that rumors were often squelched pretty quickly by FactCheck and Snoops.com. And you can sign up for daily updrafts or whatever. At least I'm on for factcheck.org. And if there's something floating around that isn't right, they'll let you know. And you can get that daily or however often. So, but I don't know if you can specifically ask them a question as to what you've heard. I'm not sure where they...
That's a great point, and thank you, because there's a number of websites now, and FactCheck is a great example. There also is I think they're calling it an Obama meter. I can hardly pronounce it. The St. Petersburg Times in Florida has a FactCheck type operation now where it's looking at every promise that was made during the campaign and now what's happening, and they measure. Okay, here was the promise, here's what's happening. And the needle goes up and down based on the response. Politico also is monitoring this administration very closely. Never seen this before, and it's basically because we have all of these electronic tools. I don't know if you can go and ask a question, but that's what emails and websites and those blogs are for. It should give you access to ask somebody there, I've heard about this, what's going on? That's on a national level. I would think there will be some local news organizations, if they have the staff, it would be smart to say, we're kind of the rumor squelchers. We'll check it out, we'll put it up. So that is one way of kind of checking on what's going on and keeping news media reports or reports that you've heard of on some news media kind of in line. Thank you, that was a great reminder. Show of hands, how many of you are subscribers to the Missoulian? And how many of you like what you saw in the paper today? Okay. How many of you did not like what you saw in the paper?
We lost one column in the front page, so it's now 5 instead of 6.
Okay. That worries me. Do you read the Missoulian online? Anybody go online? Occasionally. Okay.
I might say my children back east read Missoulian online all the time.
That's one thing we find in journalism schools is they don't come in and read all the papers that we get, all the newspaper papers, but they're following it online. And there's a huge, now as we move around, we really can follow our hometown paper if they're online.
I just wanted to say that I'm a former reporter at the Missoulian. I haven't been there for a couple of years. So I had no idea about this change in the size of the paper. It's the second time they've done that. I like the size of it. It's easy to hold and to read. And when you look at it, it looks like things are missing, but when I checked, I found the usual items in there. So I don't know if it has to do with advertisement or not. I don't keep track of that. But it's all in there. You have the daily records, and you have the obituaries, and you have your comics and your Dear Abby and your stories and stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah, there's one of the top newspaper designers in the world is Mario Garcia, and he this is about 5 or 6 years ago. He was redesigning the Miami Herald, and he told the Herald, you got to go to tabloid size. Don't keep that big size paper. It's too unwieldy. If you're reading it on an airplane, if you're trying to share it, he says, go to tab size. And they didn't want to because it's a huge newspaper. And if they went to tab size, it would be way too thick. And that was his point. You'd have to cut some of it out. And you'd have to make what you publish in the paper part of the product really important. And then you'd put the rest online. He then went and designed the Kansas City Star. So that's when I was just an hour down the road. And again, he tried to convince them to go to the tabloid size. That hasn't happened yet at most newspapers, but you are seeing what you're seeing with the Missoulian, which is a narrower and narrower paper. When I saw it, I held it up and I thought, I wonder when they're going to turn it this way. I don't know. But some people say it would be a much more reader-friendly size of a newspaper. And you see that in a lot of European newspapers. There's a middle size that's called a Berliner size. And some people say that's really, if newspapers really want to be reader-friendly with their print part of their operation, they really need to look at how people use the paper.
A few years ago, I paid $5 for the Sunday New York Times and waited till 3 in the afternoon for it to arrive by bus from Seattle. And now I read the New York Times every day for free. And I've heard it said that that's just not sustainable for the general large metros like the Washington Post and LA Times, and that we're getting something for free which we're going to have to pay for, or they're going to have to cut back on either the quality or the amount that they're providing. What do you think about that?
That's a very big conversation that's been going on for a number of years. It kind of died down, and now it's very active again. And indeed, the head of the Associated Press just made a comment in the last week saying he foresees a time when we're going to be paying for content again online, and we'll just be very used to it. There are other people who say, you know, think about television. Do you pay for that content? There's a lot of news. How are we paying for it? What about radio? How are we paying for that news content? So some people say it's just figuring out the models, and it may not be the paying for it as an online model that is going to be the answer. No one really knows right now. There's talk about the micropayments. That's a big conversation right now. And you can subscribe. I saw one figure. What about $2 a month just to get access to anything at some website on the news? Or you could pay per story. And you need to have an easy way to do that, because if you have to register every time or pull out the credit card or give them some information, but they're looking at, is there a PayPal type of payment device where you just click and say, yeah, that's what I want, and it costs you 10 cents. But again, I'll go back to the network news. How are we paying for that? We don't have to. We buy our television. You pay for cable, but advertising. So some are saying, no, it's got to be through advertising. No one has the answer. I think you're going to see a lot of experimenting. You remember the New York Times did try a pay for content model, and it put its columnists behind the screen, so you had to pay to get them. And I think it lasted, 19 months? Something like that. And they realized that for their advertisers, the more eyeballs that saw those columnists actually made more money for them than making us pay for it. So it'll be a mix. And the interesting thing, and what I tend to say is, we are swimming in the sea of all this changing news media. And so it's very hard for us to step out and say, what's the right way to go? There's a lot of experimentation going on. We have my yoga partner here. So she's telling me to stand up straight and remember to breathe.
I was thinking of the Wallinder effect with the balance and not falling. This doesn't really apply to Missoula or even Montana that much, but how do increasing languages in particular markets? So you mentioned San Diego. I would assume that there's a lot of Spanish-speaking people, and how do newspapers approach that?
Ethnic news media, along with small-sized community papers, have been for print the growth areas, big growth areas. So in a lot of markets, you will find people from various countries, and they're putting together their own newspaper. More and more, though, you're finding it online because paper and delivery can be so expensive. A number of news organizations are printing in English and Spanish. And the danger of doing that is that you've got to have someone who's a native Spanish speaker. Because if you don't, you lose your credibility right off the bat. And I saw an experiment with that in Topeka, Kansas when I was there, which has a very large Spanish-speaking population. And they started putting a Spanish page together. And they translated what they had from English. And I went to a credibility forum of Spanish-speaking folks. And the first thing they said was, you got to get somebody else to do the language. The other thing that interested me was there was no unanimity of opinion on whether a Topeka paper should do something in Spanish. Some people said, yes, but you know, a lot of us are learning English, so put the English on one side of the page and the Spanish on the other, and we can read them both. And other people said, no, we're in America now, and we want to speak English. And then other people said, I've been in America, I'm third generation Mexican-American, and I don't even speak Spanish because I only speak English now. So it's very unique to a neighborhood, it's unique to a community. It's also now you have, and I haven't used them, but you have those translator devices on computers that can turn a web page into another language. I think what you're seeing is, you know, just very successful niche publications. The one-size-fits-all is very difficult these days, and that is why the Voice of San Diego, I think, is really doing well, doing better than the local newspaper on a number of stories, because it's targeted. What are we going to be good at? And you know, the city newspaper kind of has to be everything to everyone, and that's a challenge right now. And it does force mainstream news organizations to say, can we, with fewer people, be everything to everyone? Or do we have to figure out what are we best at, what's our franchise, and the rest, it either goes away, or I would say you leverage that and you use citizen content.
I had a question on how the subscription revenues compare with advertising revenues, and is that something, the relative mix, is that something part of this experiment that you're talking about that the newspapers are going to try to change in the future?
You know, there was a day when I knew those percentages for newspapers, but basically the subscription that you pay for doesn't really support the newspaper that much. It all comes through the advertising, classified and display advertising. And the real problem, wait, I think we have a former publisher in the room. Do you know what the percentage is?
Well, in what we call the good old days,
okay,
it was about 75% revenue was advertising and 25% was circulation. Some of the bigger city papers went up to 80% of the revenue was advertising. Now I'm completely out of it. I have no clue.
The last I'd heard, it was trending more toward the 80 and more for advertising, and subscriptions were not what you were relying on. And you know what happened was the triple whammy right now, because the big areas where you make that money is in your real estate advertising, your employment advertising, and your automobile advertising. On all of them. And it really all started when you had this little thing called Craigslist in California. And all of a sudden you had classified advertising for free. And you know, and then what are you going to do for paying for it? But it's really it's the advertising for newspapers, and you know, they're all playing around with so many mixes these days. But the subscription content isn't paying for it. Now, with some of these online models, subscription-based may, or as you see, I mean, they're sounding like public radio and public television. They're seeking donations. And if you go on some of these sites, it's like, you know, you can, you know, we need your help, donate. So expect to be asked by a lot more people for donations to pay for good journalism today.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. This gets back to the socialization of having your coffee in the morning, holding your newspaper, and not walking all around the place with your laptop. What do we do about that?
Well, you know, it can be a generational thing. A lot of our news media habits indeed are habits. So yeah, and that is something where paper is a wonderful thing, and it's tactile, and you can share it, and you can have the sports section, and I can have the horoscope. But what you find with younger generations is they can do that all online. Not only that, I didn't talk a lot about just the whole mobile device, cell phone. I mean, I read the New York Times and the Washington Post on my little cell phone, because you can't get it daily. And as you've got 5 minutes here, you can look at the headlines, you can follow the sports scores, and so I think it's generational. I don't know. There's been a lot of research into Generation Y, or the millennials, who are, let's see, what do we say, about 15 to 27 years old about now, I think. But will they consume news media, and in what form? And the studies show just an array of results, but essentially they're showing, these are people who've been around computers and technology almost since they were born. Very different from, say, me. So for them, it's not a big deal, coffee with a laptop. Go in any kind of coffee shop and see what's going on. You got to have the wireless access. And that's a challenge for a lot of the rural parts of this country, including Montana. And so that you still can't do that in a lot of places. But by the same token, you find that the younger generation is very interested in the news. Indeed, is known for not just wanting the frivolous celebrity stuff, very interested in volunteering, big service component of what they've grown up with, and really are interested in news topics. But they also want to be involved in some way. So again, it's not that one-way delivery. So the idea of paging through a newspaper is something where I can't respond instantly. I can't send someone, hey, did you see this story? I can't pass it on. I can't reply. So I think it's generational, but I think what you're going to see is a mix. Because if you look at magazines, magazine readership until this year, magazines were doing well. And there is something about sitting down with a magazine, and you'll see young people not open newspapers, but they'll look at magazines. So I think it's all what we get used to and the habits we have. For me, the important thing is that as a community and as a country, we continue to be interested in news. And however that is disseminated, however we consume it, that's fine by me. The choice is great, but the fact that we need to have that availability, and we need to be interested in it, are what are important.
Thank you very much, Peggy.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for reading, and we'll see you back here next week.